Well, good morning, Little Masters, and welcome to today's Tolkien Times. I'm Alan, the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and the TTT is my way of bringing you a little Middle-earth every single day. Now, if you want even more Tolkien, be sure to listen to the award-winning Prancing Pony podcast, as we now approach the end of our 7th season. For today, though, let's get started with Tolkien Tuesday. Last week, we looked at letters number 125 and 126 as Tolkien was working to get the Silmarillion either published alongside The Lord of the Rings or freed up from Rayner and Unwin so that he could take it to a different publisher, Collins. Now, today we'll continue looking at this developing story and maybe talk about a what-if or two. We'll start by looking at letter number 127, which is dated April 14th, 1950. Now, that's about 5 weeks after the letters we looked at last week, and in that intervening time, Unwin had reached out to his son Rayner to get his opinion. Now, a quick reminder, Raynor Unwin was the young boy who wrote that little book report on The Hobbit that helped ensure its publication by his father's firm. He wrote, "Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit who lived in his hobbit hole and never went for adventures. At last, Gandalf the wizard and his dwarves persuaded him to go. He had a very exciting time fighting goblins and wargs. At last they got to the Lonely Mountain. Smaug, the dragon who guards it, is killed, and after a terrific battle with the goblins, he returned home rich. This book, with the help of maps, does not need any illustrations. It is good and should appeal to all children between the ages of 5 and 9. I love that. He was 10, so of course, I'm a little above that. It's brilliant stuff. The thing is, though, that note of his was written in 1936. It's now 1950, and Rayner is studying at Harvard University. Over the years, he's read much of The Lord of the Rings, and so Sir Stanley Unwin asks his opinion regarding Tolkien's desire to see that work and the Silmarillion published together. Rayner wrote back to his father, and in another example of that wasn't meant for him to read, Stanley enclosed those comments in his reply to Tolkien. Now, Rayner wrote in part, and I'm pulling this text from a combination of the Letters volume and the Carpenter biography, since the Letters volume is edited. He wrote, "The Lord of the Rings is a very great book in its own curious way, and deserves to be produced somehow." He goes on to point out that while Tolkien may think the Silmarillion is necessary to understand the Lord of the Rings, Rayner had never felt the lack of a Silmarillion when reading it. He suggested maybe an editor could incorporate any really relevant material from the Silmarillion into The Lord of the Rings without increasing the already enormous bulk of the latter and, if feasible, even cutting it. Tolkien wouldn't do it, Rayner writes, but someone whom he would trust and who had sympathy, one of his sons, he writes in parentheses, might possibly do it. If this is not workable, I would say publish The Lord of the Rings as a prestige book, and after having a second look at it, drop the Silmarillion. Ouch. Have a second look, apparently for appearance's sake, and then drop the work that Tolkien insists is necessary to understanding his entire subcreation. And that opinion belongs to one of his biggest supporters, too. Now, that brings us to letter number 127 itself, in which Tolkien addresses the fact that Sir Stanley Unwin sent him Rayner's notes instead of giving him his own opinion, beginning with the fact that he was puzzled by the enclosure of an extract from a letter of Rayner's. This was not, as he remarked, intended for me, which made it all the more interesting to me. The puzzling thing was that it seemed unsuitable for my eye from your point of view, and I wonder precisely why you sent it to me. My present conclusion is that you were in general agreement with Rayner and thought that letting me see his advice was a good way of telling me what is the most I can hope for, since he is about as favorable a critic as I am likely to get. But I should like to be sure. But in the fuller version of this letter, revealed in the Carpenter biography, it's clear that Tolkien was even more furious. He wrote back, saying that Rayner's notes confirmed Tolkien's suspicions, quote, "that you may be willing to take the Lord, but that is more than enough, and you do not want any trimmings. Certainly not the Silmarillion, which you have no intention of genuinely reconsidering. A rejection is, after all, a rejection and remains valid, but the question of dropping the Silmarillion after a discreet feint and taking the Lord edited just does not arise. I have not offered, am not offering the Lord of the Rings to you or anyone else on such conditions as surely I made plain before." Tolkien then gives his ultimatum to Unwin. "I want a decision, yes or no, to the proposal I made and not to any imagined possibility." In other words, both or nothing. None of this have an editor incorporate any necessary bits, cut the length, fake a look at it, and drop the Silmarillion. That is not going to fly with Tolkien. Well, be careful what you ask for. 3 days later, on April 17th, Sir Stanley Unwin provided his answer. I am more sorry than I can say that you should feel it necessary to present me with an ultimatum, particularly one in connection with a manuscript which I have never seen in its final and complete form. As you demand an immediate yes or no, the answer is no. But it might well have been yes, given time and the sight of the typescript. With sorrow, I must perforce leave it at that. And just like that, Tolkien was free to take his manuscripts and go to Collins, where Waldman was excited and absolutely convinced that Collins would publish both works. Now, I can't help but wonder what would have happened had that taken place. Would a Silmarillion published in the mid-1950s been as thorough as the one Christopher brought over the finish line in 1977, 4 years after Tolkien's death? Would it have been so ponderous a work that it might have driven folks away from The Lord of the Rings? Or would the fact that the answers to so many questions raised in The Lord of the Rings would be immediately available in the Silmarillion take away some of the mystery, depth, and textual ruins of the Third Age story? We'll never know, of course. Now, next week, we will walk through the mess that took place at Collins and how Tolkien ended up back with Allen and Unwin as we spend time in the pages of Carpenter's biography and more of the letters, but still not 131. Folks, plan on joining me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Please like and subscribe on YouTube and follow or subscribe on your podcast apps to make sure each episode gets downloaded to your device. Follow at Tolkien Times on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.